Yeah, I ain't no suit-wearing businessman like you. You know, I'm just a gangster, I suppose, and I want my corners.
Welcome to the Five Corners Podcast. I am Jet Bonifay. And on the other lines, we have Ace Merluza and Maris Stoyadora. Good evening, gents. How are you?
What's up? I miss you guys.
I know it's been
Miss you too, Ace.
it's been a little bit of a crazy week and a half. So
Yeah,
I don't
it's
think
been
crazy begins to find it.
yeah, no, I think the
Right.
whole year, this decade might be a crazy decade.
Buckle up,
Right.
fellas.
Yeah. So in light of what's happening across the U.S., we wanted to have a conversation about how really the brazen murders of, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, John Crawford, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, and countless other Black Americans at the hands of those who were sworn to serve and protect them have been really the catalysts for what you're seeing now in the United States, all 50 states to be exact. It's really a galvanizing force for what we're seeing in the streets right now, with all kinds of demographics being involved, old, young, white, Black. So we wanted to kind of go through that. We wanted to discuss how we can be allies for our fellow people of color. And we also wanted to tackle the inherent racisms in our own culture, right? As Filipinos, it's kind of been embedded, unfortunately, the colonial thinking, starting with the Spanish and then obviously with the Americans. I think part of that seeped into the culture. And there's definitely a lot of classism, colorism, and certainly racism in our Filipino community. But if you guys don't mind indulging me, I'd like to go first today. It's been stewing with me for the past week. It's been tough. I've had struggles with extended family members. So if you guys don't mind, clear out James Harden style for me a little bit, and I'll kind of go, and then we'll go from there if you don't mind.
All right, let me go to the other baseline really quick.
That'd be
You're waving up the screen, right?
That's right. Waving
up the screen.
Just be
Okay.
ready.
All right.
Be on the wing.
So let's start with Black Lives Matter, right?
Mhm.
Why is this fucking controversial? Nobody in this planet is saying that only Black lives are more important, that Black lives are more important than any other lives. I think what we're trying to say, what the movement is trying to say, is that they want to acknowledge what's happening in the society's systems that have been built with the implicit and sometimes like the extremely explicit construct that Black lives don't matter. So I'd like to kind of key in on one example specifically. And my cousin is a surveyor, so she knows a lot about this. It's the product called redlining, right? So I don't know if you guys know what this is, but it's been in practice since probably the early 30s, after the Great Depression. Basically, the Federal Housing Commission, the Federal Home Loan and Bank Board, along with the Homeowners Loan Association and Corporation, took maps of cities across the United States and basically began color coding them based on like extremely, air quotes, desirability, security, and financial stability, right? So because of that, inner city, urban, and specifically Black and POC communities were left out of that mix. So from the very beginning, they were disadvantaged. So what that basically meant was you had the sliding scale, with the red line cities being the lowest, the least desirable. And then you'd have these, cities and communities that were deemed more desirable, more financially viable. And in those red line communities, they basically starved them of financial services like mortgages, banks, and it ultimately led to bad public schooling, bad public services, and then corporations obviously would not go to these areas because, the likelihood that they would turn a profit would be relatively low. So what it basically did was it created an environment where you were building generational poverty, right? So, and I think this is the beginning of all of it, right? So all of the things that we're talking about, and we're not even touching about any of the policing, any of the other inequities that are occurring. Just first and foremost, in the U.S., the biggest barometer of wealth, and the fastest way for Americans to accrue wealth, is through property ownership. And this system, funded and supported by the federal government, basically sought to keep these communities in poverty for basically all of eternity. So I think that's the first starting point. And this is what this Black Lives Matter movement is about, is basically, it's highlighting and bringing to the forefront the systemic racial inequity and all of the systems that have been built on top of it, and then finding a way to break it down and move towards a change where the merits of the people, as opposed to where they were born and what communities they were born, are what are going to drive that person's value and worth. So I think that's where I want to start our conversation. Is, I think, we were talking right before we got on air about Ace looking for a home and trying to find where that is. Imagine not being able to have that ability to say, I want to be able to buy the house that I want, because you just can't get a mortgage, right?
Yeah, and that stinks. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on what all of this means for me personally, right? I've been very silent socially for the most part, because it's just not my style to engage. Unlike Jet, who wants all of the smoke,
Want
and
all of it, man.
engages everybody, which I respect and admire, and have come away inspired by it. I've done research. I've read every argument, tweet, and news article about the movement, about systemic racism, and I'm ashamed to admit that I haven't a clue about the depths of which this permeates our society. And that's part of the problem, right?
Yep.
I mean, Jet, you highlighted a huge example of my ignorance about the practice of redlining. Now, we all know what's going on downtown in our hometown in Jersey City, right?
Great example.
And here in Austin, specifically East Austin, which is a historically Black neighborhood and was redlined for the reasons you stated above, it's currently being gentrified at an accelerated pace. And I patronize many restaurants in East Austin. Hell, I even get my haircut there. And a part of me feels guilty in lieu of things I've said about people moving to downtown Jersey City, right?
Right.
A part of me feels guilty because of what gentrification means for the community that has been there for years as a result of being redlined. And now, all these years later, they're being pushed out.
Right.
And we're just scratching the surface. I've saved countless articles. I've watched some movies. I've read quite a few articles before bed, because I want to be part of the solution. And it's encouraging and inspiring to see many people going about it in their own way. I've never been forthcoming about this. And again, I find this to be part of the problem. And I guess the first step, at least for me personally and for many others, is acknowledging that. But I'm open about it now, and I want to be educated. And I guess my talking about it openly on this pod is a valuable first step.
Great point.
I mean, what you just said about redlining opens up a lot of doors that we can go through. But I think for me personally, this has been a really kind of tough week to kind of search where my role is and all this. And I think after our last pod, when everything now has started coming to a head, I don't know, and I'm still trying to find my voice in all this craziness that's going on, because I think, and Ace will test this, I'm generally forever the optimist, and I think I've always had to look for the good in people, no matter how bad I think society can get on both sides. I think I've always given everyone the benefit of the doubt, but man, it's been hard not to look at what's going on and kind of seeing just a bunch of, like, even though we have to be conscious that there is a revolution going on, which is a good thing, but at the same time, man, it's like a scab. Like, eventually wounds will heal, but it's ugly. Like, it's ugly at first. Like, your scab is ugly at first before your skin actually heals, and it's just been tough for me to see just how ugly people have been getting in counter to what seems to be all all the good that's going to possibly come out of everything that's happening. But I think when initially everything started, and I started posting videos that have been happening from the protests, from the riots, and just kind of realizing that not everybody's in this to. A lot of people are kind of in this for themselves, and there's a lot of narrative twisting on both sides. And I got tired of just kind of being on social media for a while, because it's just like there's arguments that are shifting one way and arguments that are shifting the other way. And I've never been one to take sides. You can't have that. I'm realizing you can't have that attitude in this right now, man. You have to take a side for what you really stand up for. You've got to look for your real voice, and it's not a point in history now for yourself. If you're on the fence, you got to jump to one side, because I feel like if you're on the fence and kind of just looking onward to see where the outcome's going to come from, you're ultimately
complicit, right?
Complicit, and you're allowing what's taking place to happen, even though you think it's wrong. And I think I took a step forward this weekend. I had a really busy weekend, like I was telling you guys earlier. But one of the things that we did, we couldn't. We're in New Milford, so we're away from all the big protesting places like Jersey City, New York, and stuff like that. So we, in our town, we had a peaceful protest, and me and my wife felt compelled to go to that. But then she brought up an interesting thing. She goes, "Do we want to bring Xavier?" Which, my oldest 10 years old, and in the back of my first thought is like, no, look, I want to protect him from doing all this stuff. But then,
right.
My wife had a very wise thing. It was like, we can't protect him from this all the time. He's gonna eventually have to know what side he wants to fight for, and realize that racism is wrong from the get. And I had to take a double take real quick, because I know that I want to teach him right all the time. And I thought to myself, why am I going to keep it? Why do I want to keep him from this, when I know that this is probably what he's going to be fighting for within the next couple of years? He's got to pick a side. And it was a big realization on my part that you got to pick a side, because you're going to have allies on both sides, but you have to ultimately stand up for what you think is right. And I think that's the realization that I'm having from all this that's going on.
Yeah, for me, and he's kind of alluded to it a little bit, right? My initial reaction to it was just I was incensed by all of this, right? Reading, and you guys know me, I'm a data guy, so I immediately started grabbing for information, for data, and you start hearing about these stories. Breonna Taylor, no knock warrant was issued on her. They busted through her door without identifying themselves. Then they began shooting inside of a residential home, right? Obviously, Trayvon Martin, we know about that. So the more you kind of dig, to the point you're making, Maris, you can't take a side, because there's obviously a side of wrong, and there's obviously a side of right. It's not like this is one of those gray area opinion things, right?
Right.
It becomes Jedi versus Sith almost, right? It's so incontrovertibly wrong that, to your point, you need to pick a side. And not only that, I think that's a beautiful thing that you did for Xavier. I love the picture of him with his little poster up during the protest. That was great. But you're right. Same with my kid. We grew up in an environment, like we mentioned before, where it was multicultural. Here, where he's going to live, it's generally, pretty white, but then you have affluent, Black people. But the policing here can also get excessive, right? So you need to have that. I needed to have the conversation with them to say, this might happen to you guys. You guys, when you're teenagers, might be in a car and it might be one or two of your black friends. They might be driving. You guys might get pulled over. This might happen. And to have that conversation with a 9-year-old is sad in more ways than I can count, right? The fact that you had to have him break the reality of, to your point, they don't know any of this stuff exists. In their mind, these guys are guys on my basketball team. They don't see color. To them, it doesn't exist. It's my best friend down the block. It's my best friend on my AAU team. It doesn't exist for them. But to your point, you can't shelter them forever because they're going to run into it. And if they don't know that it exists, they're not going to know how to deal with it. And I think that's the more tragic part. I think that's the part that, you're right, that worries me the most. And that's why I've been so vocal, is because unfortunately I have a lot of extended family that lean right, which is crazy to say considering we're Filipinos, we're immigrants, but I have a lot of, family members, some here, some in the Philippines, that lean towards the right side of the equation, right? Who kind of foster the ignorance and nonsense that Trump and his group kind of foster. So it's difficult for me to come to grips with because I need to have more of those conversations. Ace, what about you?
Part of what's been going on with me the past few weeks is like examples of my experiencing outright racism as a child. Our parents didn't sit us down. They didn't, at least my parents didn't tell me to avoid black people. They never did that. They just had me stay out of trouble, right? But when I think back to how I responded and how it influenced me going forward, the more wrong I felt, the more I felt like I don't want this to happen to Charlotte or Jack.
Right.
And back to my point earlier, being part of the problem, that those experiences at an early age, for me, subconsciously influenced me to kind of toe the line and avoid that ugly topic of racism, right? Because
Sure.
I just kind of came in with that mindset. Well, it doesn't apply to me. We're a model minority, and to Maris's point about it being ugly, it has to get ugly. It has to get dirty. We have to feel uncomfortable. I mean, I feel uncomfortable talking about it now. And until we all accept that and begin to educate ourselves, then and only then will we see progress. And I think what we're seeing right now, it feels different. It really feels different.
Yeah, I agree.
And I'm not always an optimist, but I do sense a bit of a revolution here. So I'm hoping some good does come out of it.
Yeah, you generally feel like things are changing. I think it's what was great to see on social media is that this is affecting the entire world in ways that the other, not to take away from all the other things that have happened within the last, say, 10 years racially in America, but this was the catalyst that sparked all of the world to stand up and say Black Lives Matter and what systemic racism is wrong. And I think it was a very interesting sequence of events for me this weekend. And one of the culminations of the weekend was at the end of Sunday, ESPN rolled a 30 for 30 on Bruce Lee.
Yeah.
Be water. And I'm a sucker for anything Bruce Lee. So what I loved about this particular documentary was it did go into the racism he faced in more depth than I think any other documentary had. Other documentaries have kind of glanced over it, but I think the yellow face racism that Hollywood was putting on him was a great insight as to, like Ace said, yeah, the Asians are the complicit race. There was still racism going on, but in a different way than the Black community was facing, which is why I think initially growing up, when we were talking about racism, yeah, I agree with Ace. A lot of what was happening to the Black community didn't apply to us. So we kind of think back then just we're complicit about it, even though the same people that were treating Black people like they were dirt were treating us kind of the same way, but like it was like a white glove type racism, which is, I don't know if that's worse, because you're trying to assimilate the Asian culture to be part of the white culture, at the same time not treating them equally either. You know,
Right.
I think I'd rather know where I stand.
Yeah, we're
than,
pets.
right? Than be your pet. I think that's the greatest thing that I wanted to take away from that. It was like, I would rather be the animal that you're afraid of, quote unquote, than be your pet.
Right. And I think part of it too, guys, is, and I'm guilty, right? Just like I mentioned, a lot of this has forced me to look into the mirror and kind of assess where I am when it comes to knowing my own Filipino roots and Filipino culture. I didn't know about all the racism against us early in American history, right? There was a law. There was a law that was put into place that said Filipinos could not marry white people. I mean, that was a law instituted on a federal level, right? We obviously built, just like our Chinese brothers, a lot of what was happening on the West Coast. We were down in New Orleans helping build that. Obviously, we were in Hawaii in the plantations, but we were basically an analog, to the point you're making, Maris, to our African brothers, right? We were brought over here to be the laborers that built this country. A lot of us don't know that. We take that for granted. We either don't realize it, and that's a problem, because to the exact point that you make, we whitewash it away like they never treated us that way. Right. When we were one of the first, along with them, we were side by side in the same trenches, building this country on our backs. You know, so I think that's a poignant place to be. Is the other part of it is, we were taught never to put our head up and, you know, cause trouble, right? You know, my mom says it all the time. When stuff was happening at work, when racism was occurring, everybody put their head down, everybody walked away, because nobody wanted to be that troublemaker, right? It's that subservience. You know, people love Filipinos for their hospitality, but we're also too quiet of a culture, right? The model minority thing is something that we kind of bandy around. We love that word, assimilate. We love to be just like the ruling class, because, you know, we affix value to white culture. And, you know, there's $1 billion industry in the Philippines right now where you can literally whiten your skin to be lighter than what it is, right? Because there's something inherently in their minds bad with being dark-skinned. That, to me, is adopted from what we got from the colonialism coming into us. So we brought that all along with us. People forget that our heroes in the Philippines died and fought these revolutions to keep us away from, you know, indentured servitude, from slavery. And all we're doing is we're giving it all back, right? And let's approach it right now. We're terrible for it. And we know, because we live in these families. I've sat around in parties and had conversations, and an aunt or an uncle would be like, "Oh, who's she dating now? Black guy? Why a black guy? She couldn't find the Filipino guy? There were no white guys available, right?" Or if they bring home a white guy, it's like, "Oh, that's great. You're dating a white guy." And we never stop it, right? Because we just kind of, you know, we grinned and we're like, "Yeah, you know what? You really shouldn't say that." But it was never an outright defiance of it. So I'm going to give you an example of what happened to me this week. One of my extended family members in the Philippines posted something abhorrent about the George Floyd death. It was the talking head nonsense from Candace Owens. I don't know if you guys know who she is.
Yeah.
Right.
Familiar with who she is.
Okay. So we all know, obviously she doesn't, right? But she posted it and was basically like, "Yeah, I agree with everything that she says. He had drugs in his system. He deserved what happened to him." And I was like, hold on, right? You bandy yourself around as a Catholic Christian. You know, Jesus was the first guy to put his arms around the marginalized people of his time. And you're sitting here agreeing with this. So that level of hypocrisy, I think, is really what incensed me. Like that level of thinking that somehow because they have failings in their life, drug addicts, alcoholics, whatever the case may be, that they deserve this type of treatment, that somehow they're less than human and they don't deserve the benefit of the doubt. I think that's the part to me that worries me the most, because it's embedded into our culture. Like I said, we love white people. You know, by and large, you know, we take it hook, line, and sinker and say, this is the American dream, right? The American dream is the white dream for Filipinos. And I think we have to take a stance and say, no, we are second-class citizens in this country. You know, and I've said this on more than one occasion, I've had to work 10 times harder than an equivalent person in my position to move up in the ranks of corporations. And purely because my last name didn't end with like a white sounding name. So it's difficult for me to kind of espouse the two and kind of separate the two. But I think now, you know, to Ace's point, you feel that shift happening, and now is the time to have the very, very uncomfortable conversations. Because if you don't have them now, to Maris's earlier point, you are on the wrong side of history. You are complicit in what's happening. And if you don't do that, then you're just as guilty as somebody who was creating and saying those slurs, right?
Right. You know, and we've all experienced what you described. And again, during these last few weeks of my own personal self-reflection, I've thought long and hard about how truly effed up things have been during these times. You know, all the things we've heard and seen, and going back to being part of the problem. I mean, I'll admit to laughing off some of these jokes and just going along my way, but I've never ever called anyone out on it. Very few do, I feel.
Yeah.
And that needs to stop. And I promise to do just that. You know, call out that BS. And I'll admit that's unlike me. But you know, in order for some real change to occur, you really got to step out of your element. And for me, that's tough. And you go back to how our culture kind of conforms to, you know, holding the whites to being the standard, but yet look at their kids, us, first generation Filipino Americans. I mean, who were we influenced by? What kind of music were influenced us? What culture influenced the way we dress? Who did we idolize growing up? If you're a basketball fan, and Jalen Rose said it best. Everyone loves Black culture, but they show no love for their Black brothers at the end of the day. And he's 100% correct. And that goes back to me feeling awful when I learn about the depths of how systemic racism has affected the Black community. And it's really fucked up, man. And I feel awful for it. I genuinely do. And I'm really happy I'm getting this off of my chest, because it's just been on my mind like heavily the past few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to also to your point, Ace, you know, the scene in Do the Right Thing where Spike Lee's character Mookie's talking to John Turturro's character,
Yep.
where Turturro's character says, "Why can't you be more like this guy, that guy, and other thing?" And he goes, "Yo, look at the people on the wall. How come we don't have any Black people on the wall? Who's your heroes? Like, who's your favorite singer? Who's your favorite comedian? Eddie Murphy. Who's your favorite basketball player? Magic Johnson. Those are all Black people, bro."
Mm-hmm.
It's like something you don't realize. And then he responds with the greatest response in this movie. It's like, they're not Black. Something to that extent. They're not Black. They're not Black like you. I was like, what are you talking about? And for anybody that hasn't seen that movie, it's the most poignant movie to what we're experiencing right now. But to get back to the point of, you know, your point, Ace, is, you know, you said that it's not you to call out people on their racism at like family parties and stuff. It's not mine either, until it gets to the point where it's not like you get jokes, right, to generally be funny with your counterparts. But then when you start realizing that those jokes are coming from a root of belief, is when you got to start calling them out. And I've I've gotten good at calling out my aunts and my uncles on their rooted racism. And I think a defense that you can apply in this point is religion. Is like to the point where they'll have to either back down or just shut up. You know what I mean? So if I were to tell you Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor," would you? Does that mean you're gonna be one of the people in the crowd that says, "No, Jesus, blessed is all the people"?
Right.
And then you got to look at them like, would you say that? And then I'll have a response ready, because I'll know one of these relatives are gonna say, "I bet there were no black people back then." What? There were no Filipino people back then either. There's no Filipino people in the Bible. There's no black people in the Bible. Yet that's something that you take to law whenever you're disciplining one of us, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, to the point you made, and this is the problem. This is the hypocrisy in our culture, right? This is the double standard that we levy. How often have you gotten yelled at for not going to church? Hey, how come you didn't go to church? Why didn't you go to church? Should have gone to church, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But really, the most important part of church is what you're learning in church. And to Marisk's point, Beatitudes, right? It's everything that Jesus laid out of what he expects a human being to do and to be. And all of those tenets are exactly what these poor people are going through. What our black brothers and sisters are going through is exactly what Jesus was advocating for, right? I mean, prostitutes, lepers, tax collectors, these were the black people of Jesus's generation. And yet here we are saying, no, it's, to Marisk's point, no, Black Lives Matter. No, all lives matter. No, hold on. We're talking about the most marginalized of our society. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about, right. Inherently, all lives matter, but these are the most marginalized right now, right this instance, that requires our attention, and we need to act. And I think that's the part that we can't get over. A lot of, and here's the worst part, a lot of the racism I run into within family is, well, black people are lazy. That's why they don't have good jobs, right? That's why they can't get to good schools, because they're lazy. And what they don't realize, to the point that I just made in the beginning of this podcast about redlining, every decision that you make is not a decision that you own in this case, right? When you live in a district that has the worst public school system, that has no after-school programs for children, what do you think is going to happen to those kids? Are they going to be able to learn? I mean, I'm an engineer, so I'm able to supplementary teach my kids. What happens to a single mother that has to work 2 or 3 jobs to afford food for her kid to eat, right? And to put a roof over their head? Do you think that child is sitting there getting supplemental education? And my child goes to a good public school. So imagine, the desperate situation that these impoverished kids are running into and Ace, Marisk, Jersey City has some of the worst elementary public schools in New Jersey, right? Mm-hmm. By and large. So putting it up against the educations that we got in Catholic schools is not a fair statement, right? You can't sit there and say, well, it's got to be race because they're all going to school. No, that's number one. The kids in these schools are probably going to school hungry. They're coming home. There's nobody watching them do homework, right? They have no activities. So they're hanging out on the streets. And this is how they get caught up into crime. This is the systemic racism that we're talking about, right? Trading places, right? They flip-flopped it, and they took Billy Ray Valentine out of the hood and gave him they gave him self-worth, basically, right? They stuck him into a beautiful mansion. They gave him a job. They gave him a purpose. They gave him hope. And look what he was able to do. To me, that's the perfect example of what we're talking about here. People don't grow up saying, I want to be a criminal when I grow up, right? That's not something that one aspires to when they're a young child. They go to crime when they have no more hope, when they're out of options, when the only people that they see that can get themselves out of their situations that they're in are drug dealers, are criminals. This is the hero. These are the heroes of the people, of the children that are growing up in these inner cities. So what do you expect they're going to do from a modeling standpoint? They're going to model the behavior that they see every day, day in and day out. So that's why I'm upset, is like when I hear those types of statements from, you know, relatives like, well, no, they're lazy. They're just not as smart as you guys. No. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with nurture. Ace and I talk about this all the time. It's a wonder we got out of Jersey City alive. And that's not hyperbole, right? We grew up in some of the toughest parts of Jersey City. The only reason we survived was because we had nuclear families inside our houses. We were able to come home to families that loved us and took care of us and watched over us. And we had friends that would love us, care for us, and take care of us. That's the only reason we survived. Otherwise, we'd be out on the street too, because it's one of the options that Jersey City gives you. One of the very few, right?
Right. And it helps to have fathers that scare you straight.
There you go. Great point.
I mean,
that's a great point, right?
Yeah.
Without those father figures there, without the ability to have systems in place to keep these kids off of the streets, what do you think is going to happen? And now, you know, obviously Trump is pivoting now to defund the police, right? That's the new shiny ball that he's got running around. But it's not about saying we don't want police officers. It's about saying take some of this money and put it into social programs that will keep these neighborhoods from creating the criminals that you're trying to police, right? They're trying to fix the problem after the fact, once it's become too difficult to manage, when they've already become criminals and criminality has become their lifestyle. Catch them when they're young. Catch them when they're kids, when they still have hope, when they still have dreams, when they have aspirations to be something better than where they're currently at. That's what they're trying to say. Give them the social programs to be able to grow and get out of their situation, instead of saying, well, we need more cops because the crime is out of control. The crime is a byproduct. It's not the root cause of these problems.
Right. And if you want an in-depth look of the reality of that, I just got to shout out The Wire again. Just watch The Wire, and you kind of see what happens to those group of kids, right? And where they ultimately, and who they ultimately become, and where they wind up. It's tragic. Perfect. When you watch it, you know, and especially the one kid, right, whom you think is gonna go off in the deep end and just like F up his life.
Yep.
And he didn't.
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that. I'm sure I'm sure a lot of our listeners have already watched The Wire, but that's the perfect like study, in my opinion, into what we've been discussing right now.
That's the ultimate arc, I think, of any human being, right? Is where is your crossroads going to happen? Is it going to happen?
That's a great word for it, Maris. Crossroads. Great word.
Is it going to happen when you're younger and someone's going to get to you early? And even when it's then, is it going to be someone that's going to influence you sideways, or is it going to influence you forward? So what I mean by that is if you're on your path, and let's say you've got everything, let's say you're packed up completely with whatever your parents are prepared to give you, and you're on your way forward to whatever future that you have. Now, are you going to take the fork in the road of someone that's offering you something that's quick and lucrative, or are you going to have enough that your parents gave you to kind of say, I'm going to push forward this way because I know that this is ultimately going to be where I want to go. And like I said, that's the ultimate arc of any human being, is what path are they going to take with what tools that are given them from the beginning, and what tools are going to be acquired on that journey. And it's funny because, you know, the three of us, I think, I think we all start off the same way. We have parents at home. We have like the nuclear family. We started off with whatever was given to us. And there's a great video online that shows, I think it's a coach and he has all
Yeah.
the gym class lined
I
up.
love this. Yeah.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
start off. We're all starting off kind of the same way, but then on the starting line. But then he goes to the point: step forward if you have this. Step forward if you have that. Step forward if you have this. Step forward if you have that. When everyone that stepped forward looks back at everyone that doesn't have what they have, and he says that this is the same. We're all running the same race, but be conscious of whatever you have been given as a head start.
Right.
And I think, and if you still run that same race, anybody that's in the back can still come and beat you, but just know that they have to work extra hard to get where you are right now.
Yeah. And I think that's such a poignant example of that. It's such a good visceral example of exactly what we're talking about. And this is the part where it bothers me, right? Because this is sympathy and empathy, right? It's two things. Empathy, it's your ability to kind of put yourself in somebody's shoes, and sympathy is the means for a human to understand somebody's pain. When these people say all lives matter, are they just sitting there discounting the pain that, people in impoverished communities, people of color, they're just discounting that as not real pain and suffering, right? When they point to looters, and this is funny, this is the other part of the conversation I wanted to get into, is when you point to looters and rioters, that's a small minority of the people in these protests. And you, like I said, it's criminality. It exists it's always existed. It will always exist. And it certainly will exist in situations where the cops don't have control, right? So when people hang their hat and place their arguments on looters, rioters, you're pointing at a small, just like when people say, well, it's not all cops that are bad, right? Of course, not all cops are bad. Of course, there are people that are bad apples there in that batch. Do you allow those bad apples to spoil the rest? No, that's what we're trying to fight for. So when people sit there and focus on looters, rioters, they're allowing themselves to miss the entire point of this argument, which is people are protesting because they see it. To Mersk's point, they see the race that they're running, and they see that people are starting way behind them for no other reason than the color of their skin and where they grew up, right? So that's what I want to get across to at least my own inner circle of people that I can kind of touch and influence, is that, hey, this exists. Just because you're not feeling it every day, right?
Mhm.
The impacts of racism don't reach out and grab you every day. People are fighting it and living it every day. Coronavirus is a perfect example, right? In New York City, they found that minority communities were almost doubly impacted than any other racial group. Why is that? Because they live in projects. They live on top of each other, right? Viruses spread because of lack of distance. And this is an endemic problem because these people are all living in a project where multi-generational homes exist, where multiple people live in one room. And this is an example of that. So for people to sit there and say Black people get it because they're more susceptible. No, it has nothing to do with their susceptibility. It has everything to do with their living environment. And they're living in basically a tuna can, right? And spreading the virus. So again, a real silly and intangible example for people, but people just can't get it. Like, I don't understand why they can't get it. And I think it's just people are racist, and to the point of optimism versus pessimism. Unfortunately, I'm on the other end of that scale, right? I feel like,
pretty
motherfuckers
much.
are just racists. So that's, no matter what you say to them, they're just going to believe that, Black people are worse than white people.
I want to go back to the plight of redlining. I want for my kids' education about Black history to go beyond just slavery and the civil rights movement. I want for my kids' education about racism to go beyond To Kill a Mockingbird. Okay? I mean, what percentage of the non-Black population of the country do you think is unaware of the history of housing discrimination that prevented these Black families from building wealth at a time when everyone else was getting their piece of the pie?
Right.
I think it's significant. We grew up with diversity, and I'm forever thankful for that. I mean, I thought I learned enough about Black history when I really didn't. we didn't learn enough. In fact, I probably learned a little bit more from KRS-One. Ever listen to the song "You Must Learn"?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think going forward, history and English teachers could weave this into their lesson plans if their school allows them that. And shout out to Joe Clamera. We had a little chat about um, the Fillmore district in San Francisco, a historically Black neighborhood over there. And Joe went to school with a predominantly Black student population, and he learned more about that neighborhood because of that fact. Why can't that be commonplace in the United States? And I get it. I mean, there are a lot of states, a lot of communities, cities, and towns that may not have a large population of of African Americans, but that therein lies the problem, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about not being able to get the full brunt of Black history, and I'm speaking on my ignorance now because of that.
I mean, let's talk about policing. Let's talk about incarceration rates, right?
Mhm.
From a percentage standpoint, more young Black Americans are in jail for minor offenses than any other race in the United States. What chance do they have if you go to jail for a felony because you had more than X number of grams worth of marijuana? And again, many states now are profiting from marijuana, but yet there are hundreds, maybe thousands of Black Americans in jails right now for marijuana related offenses. I mean, if you're talking about double standards, you're allowing states to reap tax revenue for the exact same reason that men have lost their liberty and freedom. And if that doesn't explain everything that you need to know about inequality in this world, I don't know what else does, right?
Right. And this is just a fraction of everything.
A fraction.
And a fraction. And that's why before we got on, I'm legit overwhelmed, bro. I'm legit overwhelmed about how much information I've been reading up on and how it's kind of flown over my head all these years. You know, um, it's it's eye opening and it's kind of damning too, also. So
Well, I think to help you out, it's it's overwhelming to me too, because I think, and it's flown over, I think, our heads, because it wasn't something that was presented to us in the forefront of our lives,
right,
right? And I think the the greatest, I think, triumph of what's happening now is that we're all getting pretty much the education that we need to get, as far as systemic racism, as far as the plight of Black Americans. And I think with that, just like they were the catalyst for the civil rights movement in the 60s, it's the catalyst now for us to really get in depth about our own history and not the history that we were just taught in school. And to Jet's point, I think, or I, when he made the point that, you know, Black history is American history, to not to be cliche, but it is. Like, the most poignant things within the last 100 years have been because of the civil rights movement. And we have been all afforded our civil rights off the backs of Black people, right?
That's a great point.
We would not be, probably not, would not have been able to do this podcast without the fight that they had to fight. And I think it's something that we, not just as Asian Americans, as Filipino Americans, but as just non-white people in general, have to realize that if you don't stand with them, you are slapping them in the face for everything that they had fought for now. And I think if we realize that our side is with them, then we're all doing ourselves a greater service to become better people, to become a better version of the human race. And I think that's the biggest positive that I have to take away from everything that's been going on within the last. Can you imagine the last 3 months we were worried about getting sick? Within the last, what has it been now from Memorial Day? I think 15 days. Has it been like 2 weeks?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're fighting a whole different fight now. And 2020 is going to go down as a really poignant year as far as social norms and social justices. We went from this year's going to suck to wow, this year is going to be revolutionary.
You know, I'm thinking about what Ace said about shame, right? We went to St. Peter's Prep, and one of the core curricula in prep was, right, Ace, social justice.
That's right.
And I look back on it now, you know, and you just spurred it in my mind when you said the word shame, and it's kind of funny, but I took those classes for granted.
Yes.
Right? I didn't, you know, and again, I'm a teenager, so you don't really understand the scope of what's in front of you. But I remember Mr. Ford was the first guy sitting there, and to Marisk's point about, you know, what we have now as non-progressive as it is was built off of the blood and the lives of those who participated in the civil rights movement. And like I said, it's to me, it's a shame because, like you said, we're immigrants, right? Our parents did not come here in the 1800s and we had like a lineage of people. They flew here. They came here, right? The minimum that we owe them is to understand that history, the minimum, right? Because you're 100% right, Maersk. We owe them all the liberties, all the ability that our parents have had to work and make money and build their own wealth was because of that. And for us to ignore that and to not understand it, and in many cases downplay it or say that it's because of the culture is why they're in the position that they're in. You're right. I think is a total disservice, a total slap in their face. And I feel badly about it now. I'm super guilty because, like I said, we had chances to learn about this very, very early, and it just wasn't convenient, right? These conversations, and somebody said it, you know, I'm watching TV today, CNBC, it's kitchen table conversations. These were taboo subjects for Filipino families. They probably still are in many Filipino families. But my resolution, like I said, to all our brothers and sisters out there, people of color, is that these will be topics of conversation. I am going to be the guy at a party that goes, hey, man, you can't say that type of shit. That's wrong. Because it's just easier to look the other way, and we can't sit idly by anymore, knowing what we know, right? And that's the other part of it, too, about 2020, Maersk, is now you know, right? Now you're accountable, right? That's always what I tell my guys. Mm-hmm. You could use ignorance all you want, because if you didn't know, okay, that's shame on us. But now that it's on you and you understand what's going on and you know the plight of these people, now that's on you. Like, you have to take that. I have to take that responsibility. So, you know, like I said, I had the tough discussion with my 9-year-old, you know, what's happening, why is it happening, how long it's been happening, but we don't know all of it. And we certainly haven't done enough against it. I think the minimum step is understanding what happened. I think the real steps are, okay, now what do we do about it? You know, we have voting power. Do we involve ourselves in protest? You know, maybe that's part of it. We don't have the answers. And like you said, guys, I'm overwhelmed. I'm certainly exasperated. I'm exhausted. But imagine again, our brothers and sisters who generationally have been having to deal with this. Like, we've dealt with it for 2 weeks and we're fucking exhausted. Imagine dealing with this for over 400 years.
Yep.
Imagine how they feel. So
Yep.
again, going back to the word sympathy and empathy, right? Is yes, I have sympathy, I have empathy, but now what do we do to fix it?
Right. And, back to your point about knowing, right? That's half the battle, by the way.
Dun, 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 dun.
Just wanted to throw that out there.
Oh man. What
Come
was
on, guys. Come on. It's me. It's me.
I know.
So I gotta ask you guys, when everything was going down, I want to know what your experience with everything the last couple of weeks, because to relate mine, I think when everything again was coming to a head, I had started posting stuff on, and I'm not characteristically one to do this, but I started posting stuff that I had been seeing, and a lot of it in the beginning was the police being, for lack of a better term, annoying to people of color. And I had gotten called out by one of my friends that was a cop. I don't think I have to say his name, but because anybody that was on my Facebook will see the part of the conversation that we were having. And I was posting stuff with the caption "why," because I didn't understand why a cop would come up to a black man that's just kind of sitting around and about to take him in. And it was explained to me that the video started, quote unquote, 5 minutes late. Like what was happening before the cop was talking to him and he was claiming harassment. This is, I don't know if you guys have seen this video. It's the
FBI agent guy.
The
right?
FBI agent, yeah.
Yeah.
And I had been talking with one, and this friend of mine goes back to, we will go back to grammar school. And I would say he was one of my best friends in grammar school up until we got to high school. Obviously, everybody drifts apart when you get to high school, but
not me and Jet. I'm just saying.
You guys have a special relationship. Yeah. So he had been saying to me, the video was started late. We want to know what they were called in for, because cops just don't get called for nothing. Mm-hmm. And the conversation just kept going. And as I'm having the conversation now shifted to DM because I didn't want to put everything out there for to save him and just kind of save me, I guess, too, just because I want to know from a policeman that I respect, because I've come to him with minor things like, oh, what do I do about this traffic ticket and blah blah blah. And you come to the point where you realize that everything that he's saying is correct, but it's also in defense of a system that we don't know is corrupt or not,
Yep.
And again, this is me also being either naive or giving everyone the benefit of the doubt that there was nothing like forceful in that video, but there was everything that we could deem harassment. I would, from our point of view, from a civilian's point of view, he was being harassed, right? Mm-hmm. From a cop's point of view, they were just doing, quote unquote, their job.
Yeah, their due diligence, right?
Their due diligence. And I had backtracked my earlier comment on that particular video because, yeah, they have a point. But then I got to the point where I realized that he wasn't making comments on anything that I was posting about that was actual police brutality, that was actual, the video that I posted today was this idiot that was mocking the George Floyd murder during the protest. Can you believe that? And I didn't know that was, shout out to Anthony Magalon.
Yeah.
For telling me that was in Jersey. When from all intents and purposes, if you had first looked at that video and first looked at that
South Carolina.
Exactly.
That's what I thought.
Exactly.
I'm like, where's the Confederate flag?
Right.
Like, where is this? And then when he told me,
Jersey, dude.
When I told my wife too that it was that they're in Jersey, she's like, "What? Are you kidding?" I was like,
Yeah.
God.
Yeah, I think I told you guys about the troll dungeon that's Governor Phil Murphy's Facebook page, right? So I didn't. I'm like you, Maersk. I'm like, this New Jersey is a progressive state. There's no, we don't have that type of right wing nuttery occurring in this state. But you're right. Just that Facebook page alone just kind of shows you how much there is. But to your point, I think to me the biggest example of it, and we said it in the last pod about the other 4 officers around Chauvin, the guy who had his knee on George Floyd's neck. The other example that I wanted to kind of bring up to you guys is, what about what happened to that guy in Buffalo, that 75-year-old man? To me, the most, obviously the pushing the guy was disgusting. The next, like by a hair, like 1A, most disgusting part was the other cop. The one cop is trying to help the guy off the ground, which is a human instinct, right? You see a human being on the ground, you're going to try to help him up.
The guy that pushed him that was trying to help him out.
Yeah. And then, but the other cop was like, no, leave him there. And he just walked over him, right? So to your point, but here's my take on it. And, about this whole thing. Like we mentioned, I love cops. They keep us safe, right? But they're in a tough spot.
Right.
Especially in tough neighborhoods, right? It's basically battlefields. And people don't understand this. People that are, that are not cop apologists will be like, well, they are being, listen, we grew up in some of the toughest parts of Jersey City. There are some real bad guys out there. And if it's a choice between cops and going home to your, bad guys and going home to your family, the cops are going to err on their side. So my point is this, and it goes back to my earlier point about catch it at the root cause. These guys are going into a battlefield thinking that they're soldiers, not thinking that they're peace police officers, right? There's a difference there. These guys are ready for, and a couple of cops have said it, they're ready for war, a war that's being waged in their own community. That's tough. When that's the type of sentiment that you're walking it to the point you're making about this guy, he's rolling up to a guy, he has no clue who he is, right? Somebody called him in and said somebody's causing a disturbance. They don't know that this guy's an FBI agent. And again, I'm not apologizing for it, right? There's definitely ways that they could have handled it. But like I mentioned, the threshold to become a police officer in the United States is generally pretty low. All you need to have is a high school diploma. Now, that might be because they need more cops, but it certainly does not give these police officers enough ammunition. And I'm using, figurative ammunition, meaning they don't go through enough criminal justice school. They don't have enough of these classes. They don't have psychiatry and psychology classes, sociology classes. So what they're armed with is a guy straight out of high school you've given a 45 to and you told them, go into the toughest project in New York City and you got to take some bad guys out. What do you expect his behavior to be except combative, right? On top of that, there's obviously some bias, right? That's already baked in and built in. So in their minds, it's like, I don't know who the enemy combatants are. So from their mind, they're like, I'm going to assume everybody's an enemy combatant. And this is what we're running into, is that these guys are not part of the community. They're coming in there. Jersey City cops, Ace, where do they generally live?
Outside of Jersey City.
Outside of Jersey City.
At least a few, well, a good amount that I know.
Right.
Some are originally from Jersey City, but I know a handful that don't live in Jersey City anymore.
Correct. Right. So when you're not part of it's not like in the 50s when the cop was like the milkman who lived on your block. That doesn't happen anymore. These guys are coming in from neighborhoods that are not from the areas they police, right? They don't know the people. They don't know who the store owners are. They don't know who the good guys, who the bad guys are. And they're coming in there going, I need to come home safe to my family tonight. And they err on the side of brutality, unfortunately. But to me, that's the explanation for it all. Low thresholds to become a police officer, and the fact that they're no longer part of the fabric of the community that they police in, on top of, to the point we're making about, inherent systemic biases, all of that confluence of all of those things is what's really the root cause of what we're seeing now with all this police brutality.
And in stark contrast to that, the ones that are that took it a step further to take criminal justice classes, to take that extra bit of education, are the ones that are siding quote unquote with the protesters, and the ones that are condemning what happened to George Floyd. For the most part, I think I said this in the last part. Like, there's genuinely good cops out there at the core, but like you said, they have to adapt to the environment they're in with the tools that they were given. And it goes back to what I said earlier tonight. It's what crossroads. How many crossroads are you going to be at to mold where your life's going as a human being? You know.
Yeah.
Some of us face more than others.
Yeah, like I said, if you didn't grow up if you're not a Jersey City guy and you didn't know these people, what are you expecting every day as a cop? You know, again, not to apologize for all the bad cops out there, but you know, I was having this conversation with my wife. These guys are like soldiers. So, you know, when you're a soldier, the guy that rides in your patrol car, your life is in his hands and his life is in your hands. So a lot of what they do, a lot of the silence, that thin blue line that they keep talking about, a lot of that is because they feel that they themselves are the only ones that can keep themselves safe. And if that means silence, that's what's happening. And that's wrong. And I think that's what we need to get to the bottom of, is to say, look, just because you guys all wear badges doesn't mean you're above the law. And it doesn't mean a good cop can sit idly by and let bad cops do bad cop shit.
You know, there's so many levels to it, Jet. You know
I know.
this, man.
Yeah, we were never going to encapsulate it in one episode, right?
Yeah, you know, there's just so many levels, and that just goes back to, you know, the word being overwhelmed. You know, there's just so much information. There's so much that goes into it. You know, there's the systemic racism, the broken system, which is law enforcement, and the reform that's needed. You talk about that threshold. I think we need to screen those folks that enroll in the academy even better. You know, we need to vet them harder. You know, among other things. So, but that's a discussion for another day, because it's a bit much.
Yeah, I think for right now, I think, you know, like we said, understand how we got here, where all the potential causes of this exist and originate from. I think obviously understand our own Filipino culture in relation to that, right? And what's happened before we got here, what's happening now, and then addressing it. There's a lot of good books out there. Ta-Nehisi Coates has a great book. Ava DuVernay has a great thing on Netflix. But I think those are all, yeah, that's right. Those are all resources that I think that, you know, at least for me, things that I can read, things that I can point over to my son. Yeah, I think, like you said, I think parsing it out slowly and trying to get to the root of it, and then doing as much as we can. I think that's what we can do now to become a better ally. I mean, certainly ignoring it is not the answer anymore, and pretending that it doesn't touch us is not the answer anymore. I think engaging with it much more proactively, I think, is the only right way to go about it moving forward.
Right. And again, I'll just say it right out. I mean, I truly feel awful about it. I mean, memories from my childhood, my first experiences of outright racism that I've tucked away, they're surfacing. That takes a lot.
Right.
You know, and for me, yeah, trauma. Maybe one day I'll write about it, and, you know, I've debated whether I should. But a lot of things right now for me seem trivial. You know, the things we used to open up our phones to look at for, things we'd want to post about. A lot of it is trivial for me now. You know, I just don't see things the right way. I feel like I need to do more and be better. I've seen that thrown around, and it's true. And tonight's a good first step, and I'll leave it at that.
There's a lot of learning and growth that's going to happen for all of us, I think, going forward. And I think I want to bookend with something that I had posted on my Facebook. It's an excerpt from one of the posts that I had with the drawing that I did. Is like, I just want to look forward to a future where my 3 kids won't be put on the line to have to defend their future Black friends, or their future police friends, brown friends, green friends, red friends, whatever, from being who they are. And because I know my kids will defend their future Black friends, police friends, brown friends, green friends, red friends from all basic evil. And I think I want to bookend my plight with that, because when it comes down to it, you're either going to teach them this is what's right and this is what's wrong. You're going to err on the side of what's right, no matter how painful or how difficult it might be.
Yeah, and I think, ultimately, and it's such an eloquent statement that you made, Maris. Not only are people at a crossroads right now, the country is at a crossroads. And to bring it back to hope, like we said before, I think we all have to hold on to hope that what we're seeing now, this transformation, and Barack Obama said it, the rallies in the 60s were very, very different, very, very homogenous. It was mostly all Black people. The rallies that you're seeing now are filled with all types of people, which I think is hopeful. It's a hopeful sign amidst all the insanity that's happening. People are laying their lives on the line because they believe this is a cause that they're willing to die over. I mean, COVID is still around, right? 100,000 plus Americans have died. Gathering in protest puts you at risk. And we know that Black people, because they are more at risk, the likelihood is that somebody could get very, very ill from this. So making that sacrifice to say, this is as important as my own life, I think puts me in a hopeful position for our world. And I think all we can do is start taking the steps now and start calling spades, and not letting, just the complacency and indifference of what we've had before kind of dominate anything moving forward. So I appreciate the talk, guys. I think for me, it's just as cathartic, because like you said, Ace, it's tough to parse it all out with so much going on and so many different viewpoints. So I appreciate that. I hope, the listeners on the line and on the YouTube can get something out of it too. It's certainly not a dialogue that we're going to fix or talk through in one episode, but it's a good place to start, as Ace pointed out. So we appreciate everybody joining, and we'll see you next time.
Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter.